that some of them has been wrong, that some of them have misunderstood us, and it's only by our action they will know that we mean business. Brothers, I think I have spoken enough in this language. It is not my wish that I should be speaking to you in a foreign, and for that matter, in colonialistic language.
Along with other leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, Patrice Lumumba from the DRC, and Julius Nyerere from Tanzania, Jomo Kenyatta belonged to a highly influential generation of post-independence African leaders who were termed fathers of their respective African countries. In his formative years, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya was a champion of anti-colonialism, African nationalism, pan-Africanism, and the unity of all people of African descent around the world. Upon taking office as the first Prime Minister of Kenya in 1963 and subsequently becoming its president in 1964, he oversaw the country's transition from a former British colonial possession to an independent country over 18 years in office. Kenyatta is celebrated as the founding father of Kenya. In this episode of African Biographics, we look at the life and legacy of Jomo Kenyatta as well as a brief history of Kenya's struggle for independence. Jomo Kenyatta was born as Kamau at Ichaweri, southwest of Mount Kenya in the East African Highlands. This was in 1897. When he was 10 years old, Kamau became seriously ill with jigger infections in his feet and one leg, and he underwent successful surgery at the newly established Church of Scotland Mission. This was his initial contact with Europeans. Fascinated with what he had seen during his recuperation, Kamau ran away from home to become a resident pupil at the mission. He studied the Bible, English, mathematics and carpentry, and paid his school fees by working as a houseboy and cooked for a European settler. In 1914, he was baptized as Johnston Kamau and was one of the earliest of the KIKUYU tribe to leave the confines of his own culture. Like many others, Kamau soon left the mission life for the urban attractions of Nairobi. In Nairobi, he adopted the name Kenyatta and worked in the Public Works Department. The roots of the colonial history of Kenya go back to the Berlin Conference of 1885, when East Africa was first divided into territories of influence by the European powers. The British government founded the East African Protectorate in 1895 and soon after opened the fertile highlands of East Africa to white settlers. Even before it was officially declared a British colony in 1920, these settlers were allowed a voice in government, while the Africans and the Asians were banned from direct political participation until 1944. The native Kenyans were impacted upon by the Crown Lands Ordinance of 1915, an order that swept away most remaining native land rights and rendered the indigenous people into landless squatters, a situation that was aggravated by the influx of European ex-soldiers after the conclusion of the war in 1918. The continued mistreatment of Kenyans by colonial oppressors steered them to form a movement calling for greater political recognition of African rights. The first significant organization that pursued this aim was the East African Association, which was formed in 1921 by Harry Tuka. Jomo Kenyatta joined this first anti-settler protest movement in 1922. One of the East African Association's many purposes was to recover Kikuyu lands that were lost when Kenya became a British colony in 1920. However, this association was banned in 1925, and Kenyatta joined the Kikuyu Central Association, of which he later became the General Secretary. The aim of the Kikuyu Central Association, the KCA, was to address the colonial challenges faced by the Kikuyu people. In 1929, Kenyatta would go to London to protest the colonial policy, but authorities there refused to meet with him. In March of 1930, he went on to write an eloquent letter in the Times of London, setting out 5 issues that were championed by the KCA, and these issues were security of land tenure and the return of lands allotted to European settlers. He also called for increased educational facilities, the repeal of hard taxes on women, which were in turn forcing women to earn money by prostitution. He also called for African representation in the Legislative Council and also non-interference with traditional customs. Kenyatta returned to London several times over the next few years to petition for African rights and then remained in Europe in the 1930s to receive a formal education at various institutions including Moscow University. In 1938, he published his seminal work, Facing Mount Kenya, which praised traditional Kikuyu society and discussed its plight under colonial rule. This book signaled another name change for him, from being called Johnston to now being called Jomo Kenyatta. A significant part of Jomo Kenyatta's life journey that further inspired him to fight for Kenyan independence was the 1945 Pan-African Conference that was held in Manchester. Kenyatta helped organize this fifth meeting of the Pan-African Congress. The conference was attended by a number of key African nationalist figures who went on to lead their country's struggle for independence, such as Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana. This Pan-African Congress demanded an end to colonial rule and racial discrimination. It was an inspiration to African leaders to return to their homelands and build movements that would shake off the European imperial control. At that time, African nationalism was sweeping throughout the continent and the way was being paved for African leaders to govern independent nations free from the control of European empires. Jomo Kenyatta would return to Kenya in 1946 and in 1947 became the president of the newly formed Kenya African Union, the KAU. He pushed for majority rule, recruiting both the Kikuyus and non-Kikuyus into the non-violent movement. But the white settler minority was unyielding in refusing a significant role for the black majority in the colonial government. In 1942, members of the Kikuyu, Embu, Meru and Kamba tribes took an oath of unity and secrecy to fight for freedom from British rule. The Mau Mau movement began with that oath, and Kenya embarked on its long, hard road to national sovereignty. The Mau Mau began a guerrilla war against the settlers and colonial government, leading to bloodshed, political turmoil, and the forced internment of tens of thousands of Kikuyus in detainment camps. This was 1952. On October 21 of the same year, Jomo Kenyatta was arrested on charges of having directed the Mau Mau movement. Despite government efforts to portray Kenyatta's trial as a criminal case, it received worldwide publicity as a political proceeding. In April of 1953, Kenyatta was sentenced to a 7-year imprisonment for managing the Mau Mau organization. He denied the charge then and afterward, maintaining that the Kenyan African Union's political activities were not directly associated with the Mau Mau violence. He spent 6 years in jail and then was sent to an internal exile at Lodwar, where he lived under house arrest. The Mau Mau rebellion served to inspire protest action in many parts of the African continent, including South Africa. While Kenyatta was in prison, the British government slowly began steering Kenya to black majority rule. In 1960, the Kenyan African National Union, KANU, was organized by black nationalists such as Tom Mboya and Oginga Odinga, and Kenyatta was elected its president in absentia. Before his release, Kenyatta placed the protection of the settlers' rights in an independent Kenya, and on August 14, 1961, he was finally allowed to return to Kikuyu land. After a week of house arrest in the company of his family and supporters, he was formally released on August 21, 1961. At the London Conference early in 1962, Jomo Kenyatta negotiated the constitutional terms leading to Kenyan independence. KANU won the pre-independence election in May of 1963, forming a provisional government, and Kenya celebrated its independence on December 12, 1963, with Kenyatta as its prime minister. Kenyatta became the first president of Kenya under a new constitutional amendment. Upon taking power, Kenyatta urged reconciliation among the various Kenyan political factions and devised the national slogan, "Harambee," a Swahili word which means "let's all pull together." He also sought to gain the trust of the white settlers of the Central Highlands. This was outlined in a program of reconciliation, asking them not to flee from the country, but to stay and help make it an economic and social success. To forestall any tribally based opposition, Kenyatta consistently appointed members of different ethnic groups to his government, though he relied most heavily on his fellow Kikuyu. In general, Kenya enjoyed remarkable political stability under Kenyatta's rule, though conflicts with KANU's political leadership did occasionally break out because of ideological differences and tribal rivalries. Jomo Kenyatta also rejected calls by African socialists to nationalize property, following a pro-Western capitalist approach instead. Among those who became alienated by his policies was his first vice president, Oginga Odinga. But Odinga and the rest soon discovered that under Kenyatta's smooth facade was a politician of stern resolve. As president, Kenyatta headed a strong central government, and successive constitutional amendments increased his authority, giving him, for instance, the power to arrest political opponents and detain them without trial if he considered them dangerous to public order. Over the years, several of his critics died under mysterious circumstances, and a few of his political opponents were arrested and detained without trial. Increasingly isolated, Oginga Odinga left KANU to form a left-wing opposition party, the Kenya People's Union or KPU, in 1966. The KPU was banned shortly thereafter, and its leader was arrested in 1969, and Kenya became a de facto single-party state. 1969 also saw the assassination of Tom Mboya, a Luo ally of Kenyatta's, who some believed was being groomed as his successor. His murder on the 5th of July 1969 sent shockwaves throughout the nation and led to tension and violence between the Luo people and the Kikuyu. This tribal issue would prove to be an issue for Kenya many years later, with an example being the election violence of 2007. Throughout this whole process, Kenyatta's position was however unaffected and was re-elected for a second presidential term at the end of the year. By 1974, riding on a decade of high economic growth based on exports of cash crops and financial aid from the West, Kenyatta won a third presidential term. He was, however, the only candidate. Soon after, the cracks were starting to appear. Kenyatta's family and political friends had gained considerable wealth at the expense of the average Kenyan. He and his family also owned more than 500,000 acres of land in Kenya, much of which had been acquired during a post-colonial land transfer program. Their estate holdings made the family one of the largest landowners in a country where land ownership disputes were a long-standing source of resentment among the people whose families had been displaced during the colonial era. In 1966, Jomo Kenyatta suffered a heart attack and was plagued by ill health until his death on 22 August 1978. He was buried on the Kenyan Parliament grounds and was succeeded by his then Vice President, Daniel Arap Moi. While his importance as a prominent African nationalist and independent thinker is widely acknowledged, Kenyatta's political legacy is mixed. His time in power was characterized by a one-party dictatorship, cronyism and politicizing of ethnicity, and he and Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah are remembered both for making the dream of African independence a reality and their invention of post-colonial authoritarianism. One day we'll touch on the life and legacy of Kwame Nkrumah. Let me know in the comment section below what you think about the life and legacy of Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya's founding father. If you're new here and are interested in learning more about African history and notable events occurring across the continent, then don't be shy to subscribe and to click the notifications bell so that you don't miss out on any new uploads. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.